And people say to me, yeah, but I'm not doing it for that kind of accuracy. I just want to write a nice word. Okay, that's great if that's what you want to do. But if you are serious about being able to produce something consistently and accurately, then that's a very different conversation you have to have with yourself.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's live Q&A lesson. I'm here with Paul Antonio. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, how are you, Becca?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
So Paul's going to be teaching us a little lesson today. And before we get into that, we're just going to have a little chat here. Paul is one of the most brilliant minds in calligraphy that I've ever met. And I have the pleasure of meeting him in real life in Toronto last year and learned a ton from him in his workshop. And I just feel like I can never relay that information properly to students the way that it comes out of his mouth, because like I said, it's just brilliant. So I'm excited to get into this conversation here. So Paul, for anybody who somehow magically doesn't know who you are, can you give us a little introduction, like the synopsis of what is Paul Antonio?
I started calligraphy when I was 9, fell in love with it. And, being obsessive compulsive, I was very drawn to practicing constantly and consistently. And so I was also very lucky, which I never thought was luck, growing up in Trinidad, which meant I couldn't afford tools and materials because they were too expensive. But I was lucky enough to live close enough to the beach and to be able to find turkey vulture feathers already cooked in the hot sand. So I learned to cut quills from a young age, and I learned things like making paper and making inks. So when I eventually came to study calligraphy at Reigate, I studied calligraphy, gilding, and heraldic painting. I had this really in-depth understanding of material culture, which really helped me in my practice. And so I left Reigate with a distinction as a calligrapher, gilder, and heraldic artist, where we learned to paint coats of arms. And the year I left, I also got the Scrivener's Award, which is a livery company which was started in the Middle Ages. And soon afterwards, I was asked to join the Crown Office team. So the Crown Office is a group of scribes, 4 of us, and we still handwrite some of the laws for England, which the Queen signs, which is amazing, on vellum, which is a little bit crazy and quirky, but such is the life of a scribe. And then I also studied archaeological illustration. And as a child, I fell in love with Egyptian hieroglyphs, which I gave up when I was about 15 because I thought I'd never get to Egypt. And my archaeological illustration studies, the Met headhunted me and asked me to go out and draw hieroglyphs in a pyramid for them. So that was great, which was an amazing experience. So my life is a little bit odd. But it's always been centered around writing, and not just Western script. So I don't know if you can see some of the brushes in the background there.
Yeah, I was gonna say I see some quills back there, and I know that you have a pretty crazy studio there. So maybe you could take us on a little tour before we jump into the lesson.
So I'm gonna just flip the screen around. So here is my little library. I'm gonna take. Let me do this a little bit more slowly so people don't get dizzy. So this is my office, and in the office, there's lots of boxes and more boxes, and I have these really beautiful sort of pigeonhole things. So of course this is all paper, and there's some bits of work that I've done over the years, some heraldry, and then that's the studio. Now the funny thing is you're seeing the studio just before it gets turned around, because I'm just about to get the builders in, because I'm going to set up classes. So here's some of the pigments that I use when I do really formal painting. And then the books are a really important part of my life. I have tons of materials from lots of suppliers. As you can see, there's a mountain of Clairefontaine-Oredia products and Derwent and just tons of Kuretake products. And of course, here are my ruling pens and brushes and quills and behind the things we have ink. So, and more quills and more brushes and some vellum. So there's some rolls of vellum up there, calfskin vellum. And then, here am I. So I sit here to do a lot of my work. Some of you would recognize that table is my my social media table. And, I have some really beautiful antique holders. And you're seeing some of the new P-Scribe pen staffs, which will be coming out soon.
Ooh.
And of course, more books, more scrolls, more books, and tons of Zig calligraphy markers. Or more books. So that's sort of the studio. And the studio, I really love the studio because I'm really fortunate that I get to work with people like Kurotaki, and I get to test some of their new products. I get to see some of the things that are just coming out. Monte Verdi have just sent me a box of inks to test. Whoa, so exciting. And I have a ton of Rhodia paper. Rhodia and I are working on 3 pads, so they should be out at the end of the year. And they're really great pads. And one of the pads is a copperplate script pad that I've been working on with Telmo, my little brother and graphic designer in Portugal, on how we've developed a grid that fits copperplate script perfectly, so that you can practice the letters within the parallelograms. So there's a lot going on, and the 2 other pads are pretty amazing.
I feel like there's always a lot going on in your world, and I feel like a huge part of that is because you're a person who is constantly like pushing that envelope, which a lot of people just learn calligraphy and they learn the rules, or they learn even just the basics and start practicing that way and never really like push past or ask why is it that way, why is this line the way it is, why is it. And that was one of the things that when I took your workshop, like really stuck with me, was questioning why and questioning all of the things rather than just believing what somebody says and going with it. And I feel like you're constantly trying to find a better way to teach it and a better way to show people and explain everything behind calligraphy. So I know that you just, well, in my opinion, just came out with the copperplate manuscript that you did, but now you're on to the next thing. So can you talk a little bit about what you're working on right now?
So there are a number of things happening, and Becca, you're right. I ran a really busy practice for 17 years, and I sometimes had 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 calligraphers working in the studio with me on massive projects, on jobs for the fashion industry. I mean, and most of you, I don't do that kind of work anymore because I inadvertently damaged my hand by poor writing practice. And
I actually was going to ask you if you ever have had issues with your hands, not necessarily from writing too much, but although that is probably the more common thing. But I sliced my finger open the other day, and I can't write right now.
Well, I nearly lost the use of my thumb on my right hand because of repetitive strain injury, and it's still very painful. And whenever I write, it hurts. So addressing envelopes and doing lots of writing is not something that I can do anymore. But I spent a year crying every morning because I didn't think I'd be able to write. And I went off and I studied Reiki, and the Reiki has been really helpful in keeping the pain at bay and helping me to work through different issues. But, running a busy practice made me think about how to solve problems. So I've just set up a website, pscribe.us, and we have some new products coming out. And a lot of the new products that are coming out are products that are as a result of problems we had in the studio, like how do you get lines onto a page without having to draw them and have to erase them and smudge the ink? And I don't like people using lasers because staring at a line that's made by a laser light is really bad for your retinas. So I've come up with this new way, which we're working on the prototype should be here soon. We've developed a new ruler.
We should call you the Calligra inventor.
we have this new ruler that's coming out, and the ruler is, when people see the ruler, they're going to freak out about it. And I'm always trying to think of ways that can help people not struggle that much. And I sort of firmly believe that we shouldn't have students reinventing the wheel to figure something out if we've already figured it out. It's about getting the student to that level that you're at, so that they don't lose 20 years of practice. They can gain something in a tenth of the time, so that they can push the envelope. So, that coupled with this damage on my hand helped me to become a little bit more conscious. So I started working on this thing called a pre-basic structure. So I sort of believe that we're not really teaching calligraphy right, because we're starting people off on step 5.
Well, I mean, if you think that you're not teaching people calligraphy right, then I certainly am not teaching people calligraphy right. So I love hearing that you're pioneering all these new things.
But it's really important, because like when you were in the class, one of the things you said to me was you were so surprised that you weren't paying attention to the minutia. And it's the minutia, it's the little things that add up to make the big thing. So if we don't know what the little things are, how are we actually making that big thing? If we don't know what the little strokes are, and how they're produced, and how they're supposed to look, and how they're supposed to feel when we make them, how are we writing letters? And then we write a letter and you think, oh, it doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't work, fine. But why doesn't it work? Have you been taught to question why it doesn't work? Is it not working because you're not holding the tool correctly? So first off, do you know if you're holding the tool correctly? And if you know that you're holding the tool correctly, are you aware of what angle the tool is at, how much pressure you're putting, what is the movement like? So, and of course, you come back to something like the letter itself. I say to students, okay, so write the letter A. You'll write the letter A. And in the course of a 10-minute conversation, I ask them to keep writing the letter A. And so we should have about 15 A's in 10 minutes. And none of their A's are the same. And I say, okay, well, that's a problem, because if you cannot produce the same letter consistently because you don't really know what the letter is, how are you going to produce it consistently on a page when it's not consistent up here? And so, getting people to really think about the lettering. Why does it work the way it works? How does it come out of your hand? What is produced at the end of the tool? Do you know if that tool will work well on that paper? Or it's really pretty paper, so the tool must be able to work, right?
Well, and so you're talking about people not being able to produce the letter A, but when I took your workshop, it was literally just not being able to produce a straight line with a pencil. And so we spent, I don't know how long on doing that. And that's what really, I was like, oh my God, I can't do this. Like, it really made me question everything. So, and this is all stuff that that's falling under your pre-basics structure, yes, is what you're calling it?
Yes. But even when you and I worked together last year, I've dramatically changed that exercise. And you would think, how much can you change an exercise that's based on a straight line? And so I've been working with other students and really sort of torturing them. And I'm like, okay, so this is a straight line, so do the straight line. And then they do the straight line, and I start ripping the straight line apart, and they sit there going, what?
Well, I just remember you told us we couldn't go for lunch until we did the straight line exercise properly. But it's something
that me sound like a tyrant.
But in your Facebook groups too, and I'll link to those here for people who are interested. But in those groups too, you I think it was recently you said you've been getting feedback that you're a little bit too, or that people find you too, what's the word?
Blunt.
That's the one. But I think it's important because you don't see that very often anymore. And people who are serious about learning those pre-basics and the basics and the actual calligraphy they care to hear those kinds of things and can take that feedback. So I think it's great. But I know that you were gonna kind of jump into a lesson on your pre-basic structure. So maybe I'll take my face off here and we can get into that stuff.
Okay. So one of the things that I was looking at in this pre-basic structure is how we control a tool. So the first question is, do you really know what you're doing? Now, the edge of the table is actually here. So the pad is turned at a different angle, and I'm sitting with my arm on the table. So my arm is not off the table. My elbow is roughly, an inch and a half. So, 2.5 centimeters to 3 centimeters away from the edge of the table. So that allows me the ability to produce smooth ellipses. Now, I tend to refer to these as ellipses. I don't call them ovals because most people, when they think of an oval, they think of an egg. And if you think of an egg when you're trying to do an ellipse, especially for copperplate script, you will end up with a letter that is bottom heavy and pointed at the top. So starting to work with terminology is really important. Equally, I've been also thinking about the way that we interpret the words that we use. So when I ask people to make a straight line, I ask them to touch the top and the bottom line. And I've just made a mistake. So I've stopped and I'm going to start again. Because if you continue the mistake, then you're reinforcing in your mind that that mistake is okay. And if you start reinforcing mistakes in your mind, then when it comes to being more accurate, you don't have that level of accuracy. So this is the line here, and that's the line there. If we take a really sharp pencil, then the pencil is actually about a third of the thickness of the line. So if this is the line here, and that is the line there in relation to the pencil, are you working between the lines? Are you working from the outside to the outside, or the inside to the outside, or the outside to the inside, or you're just hoping that somewhere in there the pencil is going to go and it'll end up in the same sort of place there, and every time you do it, it'll work? So that level of accuracy is really important. I also tell students, don't hit the line, touch the line. So you're touching and you're touching. So I'm going to use, I'm holding the tool slightly higher up. So when you hold the tool at the tip, you have to take your hand down to the page. By holding the tool slightly higher up, you have better dexterity and a greater range of motion. So let's just do it over 2 lines. And from these straight lines, we have a series of complex lines. So we're going to work with these double grids. So I have these grids on the pascribe.us site. All you have to do is go there and you can download the grids. So with the straight line, as I was telling you earlier on, this is the augmented problem. So I always mark off where I'm going to work between, so I'm not sort of guessing. And notice I'm being very rhythmic. I'm going to rest the pencil. So I always start at the baseline, because you have to somehow start at your stopping point, get to the cap height, and then come down. So this is where the breathing starts to join into the writing. So a downstroke is generally on an exhalation, an upstroke is generally on an inhalation. So I'm going to breathe a little bit heavily for this. So we have and. And what that does is it allows the breath to help you create equidistant lines. The next thing that we're working on is delicacy of line. So I want the lines to be very light. I also want to be able to produce the lines at the same weight. And if I want to produce heavy lines, I should be able to produce consistently heavy lines. You should be able to do pages of these light lines, medium lines, heavy lines, and then go back to very light lines. If you can't do this with a pencil, how are you really expecting to get it done with a nib? Of course, these lines are simple lines, so we can move on to a slightly more complex structure with the lines, which is and 1 and 2. So now I'm using pressure. And so this starts you off with a much higher order of understanding of line work. Once you can produce the weight at the top and the bottom, you should be able to produce the weight in the middle. And every time I make a mistake, I don't continue that line. You know, you make a mistake and you go back and you go over the line. So I don't do that. So it's really important to be conscious of what you're doing. The next thing I tell students to do is after every group, don't do a whole page. You're just wasting time. After every group, you go back. Okay, so there's a problem here. There's a curve. There's a dot here. There's a little wiggle here. That's not bad. It's not touching the line exactly. I'm not asking you to look at your work and tell me, oh, the work's okay. I'm asking you to look at the work and go, is the work good or not? And if it's okay, then it's wrong. If there's a problem, you have to see the problems. The next thing you have to do is write them down. So what are the problems? Problem 1, problem 2, problem 3, problem 4. So then you start the second set of lines and you're working on the first problem. I'm going to get rid of this little curve. I know a curve occurs at the top or during or at the end of line when you use your fingers. As soon as your fingers are engaged, you get this little curve. Now, if you use the wrist to produce the movement, not the fingers, you get a much straighter line, or you use the arm if the line is really long. So understanding which muscle groups you're using then comes into play. So from there, we're going to jump really quickly. Now, this is a lot of jumping. I don't normally jump this far ahead. And because I'm holding the tool higher up, I have more dexterity. I have more range of movement. I have greater mobility. And of course, with my copperplate script, which is mine, it's not a historical construct. This is a geometric construct that I developed. All of my lines stay on the 55. I come down, I go around this little pulley, and I go up at 55. See, I've come down, I've gone up, and I've gone up at 55. So that then helps me to space the letters really, really well. So that's sort of my lesson.
I'm gonna need a picture of that beautiful name you just wrote for me.
So I saw you grinning as I did that. So you know, I've just rushed through maybe about 200 pages. So these are the notes for the concerted practice group that I'm building, and it's really basic things like there's that much in a PDF, by the way. Really basic things, but you know, absolutely basic things like so you do copperplate script, right?
I try.
Can you write a 50? If I give you a horizontal line and if I give you a baseline and a cap height, can you drop a 55-degree angle line on between those two lines? So, for those of you who do copperplate script a lot, and you say you do copperplate script, you should be able to write at 55 degrees. You should know what that angle is. For people who do italic and their italic is at 3 or 5 or 7 degrees off the vertical, you should be able to drop a 3-degree line or a 5-degree line or a 7-degree line between the cap height and the baseline. You should be able to just drop that line. So a lot of people don't know this, So all these little things that we're supposed to be aware of before we start writing. And that's way beyond the pre-basics. We looked at how to do a straight line. Do you know how you're holding the tool? I asked this in a class recently. So are you holding the pencil like you're drawing, or are you holding the pencil like you're writing? And everybody sort of looked around at each other. Like, but if you're not aware that the tool, when you hold the tool to write, that it's not just a different set of muscles, it's a different intention in the mind to drawing. If you're not aware of that, and you treat the pencil like a drawing tool, when it comes to using the pen, you've just wasted your time, because you have to basically get your brain into writing gear rather than into drawing gear. So how do you work out what those subtleties are in your brain and in your hand and in your muscles? I have 3 videos on YouTube which people have commented about on posture, placement, and position. How do you sit? I see people in classes, and they're hunched over the table like this, and they're writing like this. And you remember in my class, every 10 minutes, I would say, sit up.
Paul, I think I actually have a picture of you correcting my posture. So maybe when I edit this video, I'll pop it up on the screen right here.
And once you change that posture, how did that feel for you?
I'm sure it helped, but I still catch myself all the time.
Yeah, but me too.
Mm-hmm.
Every now and then I have to remember, don't slouch.
So you got to set a timer or something to remind you every couple seconds.
I think it's more about becoming aware of how you're sitting. And that awareness has to be, again, it has to be a pre-awareness. It can't be that you become aware of it when you're suffering. You get to a point and your back's starting to hurt. You shouldn't even get to that point. So, every couple seconds, you just have to sort of, I'm starting to slouch. But little things like, if you're sitting up correctly, then your arm should be able to move smoothly and produce smooth curves. If you're trying to write a letter and the curve isn't smooth, chances are you're leaning on the arm that's supposed to be moving. So you're not sitting correctly. So you have to start to become much more aware of what's happening. Is the paper at the same angle? Have you moved the paper? I was talking to a class and I said, when you're sitting and you go, and I said, even when you shift from one cheek to the next, you've just changed 10 degrees. So how is the line going to be the same if you've moved by that much? And you really start to think, I have to become so much more aware of what I'm doing so that it doesn't affect the lettering, because the letters can change. They can change quite easily by very small shifts of angles. Is the chair high enough? Some people sit and their chairs are so low, or the table's too high, and they get up after half an hour and the first thing they do is they rub their neck. Or if you're rubbing your neck, then there's a problem with the relationship of the chair to the table. You shouldn't have to suffer to do calligraphy. If you're suffering, something is wrong. And it's all to do with sensitivity and being aware of how you're sitting, how you're approaching the writing. How are you breathing? Lots of people hold their breath when they're writing. So, I asked students, why are you holding your breath? Oh, if I breathe, the letters shake. No, they're shaking because you're suffocating, right? You're not breathing. So you're like, oh my God, I have to get to the end of the word. And that's why you're shaking. But just now we looked at how this rhythm worked. We looked at how this rhythm worked with breathing. So by breathing rhythmically, you space the letters rhythmically. And the writing then becomes a real meditation. You really start to enjoy the writing. It's so beautiful. The only problem is you have to be very conscious, because if you're letting the writing become a meditation, you then end up not caring about what you're writing because you're so busy sort of breathing and producing a stroke that you can't really concentrate on the word. So, there are levels of consciousness that you have to be aware of when you're writing. And your breath is so important. When I teach textualis quadrata, I sing. So I sing some Gregorian chanting to the students. And the rhythm of the chant is the same rhythm at which the script is written. Because if you think what the monks were doing, they would go to the hours, their mass, and they would sing, they would chant, they would come back, they would go to the scriptorium, and they would write. But their mindset is still in the rhythmic value of the music. So when we start looking at how music works, copperplate script works really well with Handel. And you can hear the flourishes. You can really see the script when you start listening to music that's attuned to the rhythmic value of the writing. So it's not just about putting pretty letters on a page. It's about how are you connecting to those letters? How are you connecting to them mentally? How are you connecting to them physically? How are you connecting to them spiritually? And so that's a whole other conversation.
Well, it's interesting to me because I think the pre-basics are something that not a lot of people are talking about. Like a lot of people, myself included, start with the basics, so the basic strokes that you learn. But nobody really is sitting down and talking people through all of these like mindset things that are important at the start. And so you mentioned the 3 videos you have on posture. I think it's posture, positioning,
placement, and position.
Okay. Are those available to the general public? I think they're on YouTube.
Yeah, or? You just go onto the Paul Antonio Scribe YouTube channel, and we've put them at the top. There are some other videos that are at the top, which Telmo was the one who sort of put all that together, because you know what? Just give me a pen and some paper. Technology absolutely terrifies me. But there are things that sit at the top of the channel, like the posture, the position, and the placement videos are critical. They're things that you need to know those things before you start writing. You need to understand how to place, where to place the page. You need to understand how to sit. How do you know when the desk is too high in relation to the chair? So the posture video looks at all of this. That they were principally made for copperplate script, and I'm going to redo them to take into consideration broad edge nib calligraphy as well. Because if you're working at a slanted table, that's a slightly different set of rules. And there are other things like muscular movement. How does muscular movement work? So I've come up with, obviously I need to change everything. I've come up with a new way to apply muscular movement, which doesn't use the 4 muscles, it only uses 2, because of how we're accustomed to holding a tool. Because, I sort of feel that some of these historical methodologies that we have access to are sometimes so different and so difficult for us to use, because they were used when tools were different, when people had more time, when desks were different. So we have to take these historical things and we have to find a way to apply them in a contemporary context. And there's so much to talk about when it comes to writing. There's so much in how we approach the writing, how we approach it ourselves. I always tell students, if you work, you and I have clients that we do calligraphy for. I have a work tool. I have work tools. I have practice tools. I have play tools. So, I come in sometimes and I'm really frustrated and I'm really fed up, and I just want to play. So I pick up my play tool and I do some flourishing and I breathe slightly slower. But if I'm intending to teach myself a script from an illuminated manuscript, I take it down, I make some copies, I do a script analysis, and I pick up my practice tool. And I never play with my practice tool, because that's practice. So I know that this is hard work that I'm going to do, that my brain needs to reinforce. Then I have a work tool. So if I'm writing out a poem for a client or something, I have a tool that I do that with, which is not my play tool because I'm not playing, and it's not my practice tool because I'm not practicing, I'm working. So my brain knows that whatever happens here, I might be making notes to add to my practice, but don't hold on to that information. And so by compartmentalizing your brain and compartmentalizing the way that you approach the lettering, you start to learn to get better faster. And in the manual on copperplate script, I've put practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. So unless the practice is good practice, then all you're doing is reinforcing bad habits and mistakes. So by correcting the work as you go along, when you make a line, you might find 60 problems with that line. So you might have to do 60 pages of that same line. But by the time you correct the first mistake, when you move on to the second mistake, you've already corrected the first mistake. And our practice has a really good way of reinforcing correct habits. So by starting to get better at one thing, you inadvertently get better at something else. And so the practice becomes better and better, faster and faster. But if you never learn to write a straight line properly, then you don't produce it and you complain. Oh, the letter isn't straight. Oh, this line isn't straight. Why is this line not straight? Well, it's not straight because you never really spent the time learning to write a straight line. It's as simple as that. And there's nobody else to blame. It's just you to blame because you haven't spent the time doing the work. You look at a lot of work out there and it's really haphazard work. And, people are posting pretty things. They're using all this color. I took a class with Christopher Hannes recently, and Chris said, if you can't post something in black and white and have it stand up on its own, you don't have a right to be using color. And that really struck me because, I very rarely use color in my work. I tend to use a dark color against a white background so that students can see what I'm doing. This is how I approach this particular construct, and this is why. Of course, it's nice to, post pretty things, but, I'm sort of quite conscious of trying to help people get better. That's where I am right now in my life.
So if I think the majority of people watching this video, and my audience specifically, are people who are interested in brush calligraphy mostly, and more of the pretty pictures you see on Instagram. And I know that it could open up a whole new can of worms if we talk about the modern calligraphy trends on social media and all of that. So maybe we won't get into that. But if these people are interested in starting to get more serious about their calligraphy and getting, thinking about all of these pre-basics and learning about the proper ways to do things, where is the best place for them to join you? At that part of their journey?
Obviously, they can join the PA Scribe Calligraphy Classes group on Facebook. And they can see what other people are posting and how they're working. And, if they're working through something that I've done, I'm happy to help. I'm also working on setting up a series of online prerequisite classes and some online classes. So those should be out in a couple of months, and they'll be on the PA Scribe Shopify site. But there's so much to do, and of course, the studio. When the studio gets turned around, I'll give you a call and I can show you what we've done with it.
Awesome. Well, I'm sure you will get some new people who are interested in upping their knowledge and their skills after this conversation. Yay. I just have one final question for you that I need to ask. So yes. While you were doing your lesson, I took a picture, I put it on Instagram, and I asked anybody if they knew whose hands those were writing. And I think that people will probably know who you are because of your rings. Is there a story behind your rings?
Yes. Well, when Tim and I met 7 years ago, over 7 years ago, more like 8 years ago, he has 4 rings, 2 here and 2 here. and he took his middle finger ring, and he said because it touched his wedding ring for 10 years and he never thought he would ever meet somebody, he took his middle finger ring and melted it down to make my wedding ring. And the silver that was left over, we added silver to it, and we remade his middle finger ring, and we made me a middle finger ring. And every 5 years we get a ring. So that's the story of the rings. So we used these rings when we got married, which was quite funny because the registrar said, "Can we have the?" And when we said we're actually using 4 rings, which was like, what? I mean, it's a long story. But everybody who came to the wedding, they knew the story. So it was quite funny that these 4 rings were sitting there.
That's awesome. I'm glad I asked. That's a great story. All right. Well, thank you again so much, Paul. For
Not at all.
And I'm sure I'll be talking to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Becca. Have a good day.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.